Tonight on Primetime Politics, defending the court.
The rule of law, the judicial independence are values that are cherished by Canadians, but I think we have to protect that.
Canada's Chief Justice speaks out against politicizing the country's judicial system, warning Canadians it would undermine public confidence in the rule of law and democracy if politicians twist the work of courts for political gain. Coming up, we will hear from Chief Justice Richard Wagner himself. Also, a new leader, a continued fight. The new president of the Public Service Alliance of Canada is on the program. We'll speak to her about her union's fight against a 3-day weekly return to the office and whether or not she fears the pushback will alienate the Canadian public. Plus, Donald Trump is now a convicted felon, but Americans are divided on the matter of jail time. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. We'll get to those stories in a moment, but first, the parliamentary body that oversees national intelligence is not holding back any punches today, describing the Trudeau government's inaction on foreign interference as, quote, a serious failure for which the country may pay the price for years to come. The National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians is made up of MPs and senators across all parties. They say Canada's spy agencies have information on foreign actors developing relationships with politicians here in Canada, and some of these politicians helping these foreign actors after being elected. Here is the response that we heard tonight from the Public Safety Minister regarding the report.
We are absolutely committed to evolving and strengthening the measures that are in place. We're the ones that asked the National Security Intelligence Committee to do this work. We will obviously study their particular recommendations in the context of Justice Hugg's report that will be coming out later this year, the review agency's report, and we will work with parliamentarians to strengthen these measures.
Now, INSACOPI is making 6 recommendations to improve the situation. They include recommendations for the creation of a Foreign Interference Transparency Agency, updating the CSIS Act, and considering if party nominations and leadership races should be within the framework of the Canada Elections Act. Well, it's a basic principle of Canadian democracy, the independence of the courts to defend constitutional principles and to interpret and apply the law. But it's a role that could be undermined, says the Chief Justice of Canada's Supreme Court, if politicians start criticizing judges and rulings for political gain.
It is one thing to express disagreement with a decision, but it is another thing altogether to criticize it because of who the judge is or how they were appointed. Comments like this undermine public confidence in the justice system. We should be especially concerned when elected representatives say these things.
Well, Justice Wagner made those comments during his yearly news conference. We're now joined by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Richard Wagner. Justice, thank you for being here today.
Good afternoon. My pleasure to be here.
Listen, I want to begin with the comments you were making about public confidence in the court. Do you see that confidence being eroded or undermined right now?
Well, I think we have a good situation in Canada in general, but my fear is that we should not be too careful about that situation. In other words, it could be insidious. And, we see what's going on in other countries very close to us. So we have to be very careful not to accept any attempt to discredit the institutions and the judicial system essentially. So that it's only to prevent any further damages. But I think we have a good democracy in Canada. I think that people understand that the rule of law is essential for our democracy. And I think we have a good judicial independence. So I think it's going well, but you will see more and more in social media some disinformation and misinformation, and that could be damaging for democracy.
Mm-hmm. Damaging for democracy, as you say, because to pick up on your point, in your news conference, you were talking about it is fair to debate a decision. It's another thing to debate a judge or who appointed that judge in that role. And I'm wondering, was it a particular incident or a statement that led you to reflect on this potential threat?
Well, misinformation and disinformation is a topic of many discussed in many areas in the world. I was invited recently at the G20 summit. The G20 summit is the summit of all the chief justices of the G20 countries, and one of the topic was misinformation and disinformation, and to what extent that the Supreme Court of Brazil decided to set up a program, specific program to counterattack disinformation. It goes to show to what extent this phenomenon is present everywhere in democracies. So there were a few incidents in Quebec where there was some misinformation about the nature and the extent of a judgment that we rendered a couple of months ago. There were some comments made by one elected official about the fact that judges who have rendered one type of decision were appointed by the federal government. So that type of comments, I think that I want people to be careful not to make them in the future, because it could discredit the institution. And there are some people who may be vulnerable and will give some trust to those statements. So that's why we have to be careful. And I said this morning that we need the traditional media, who are governed by a code of ethics, will give the proper information, the right information. And that's very important.
Mm-hmm. Traditional media, as you say, but what about the role of government? Because you cite a Brazilian example. Is there a role that the federal government could be playing more of in order to help protect the independence of the courts?
I think that every stakeholder in society and in the justice system has a role to play. So government, elected officials may legislate on this issue to make sure that disinformation does not create too many problems. And the media has a role to play, and the judges and the courts, to some extent, have a role to play as well, not to be on the public sphere, in the public sphere, but to write decision clearly, for instance, to make sure that people have access to their court, and to do their part as well.
Mm-hmm. Before our interview, I just did a quick search online about justices who have, or judges who have been under threat, and the number of countries where it has happened is actually quite long. As you say, one very near neighbor, Supreme Court of Colorado, their justices were under threat over a decision. In South America, a few other examples there popped up. Have you ever heard of that happening here in Canada quite yet?
Not to that extent. But there were some comments made on social media in every province, I would say, that would fall in that category, but it's not as extensive as it is in other countries.
Okay. Before we're done, I also want to ask about an update, because last year during your annual news conference, you raised a red flag about the number of judicial appointments that were still open and how the impact that was having on the delivery of justice in this country. Recently, the government has been moving very quickly to fill in those spots, but I believe you're the one that stated the fact that there's still 57 vacancies to be filled. How worrying is that for you?
Well, as of June 1st, there are still 57 open space on the court. I think there was some improvement for the last 12 months. Obviously, the red flag was seen by government. Obviously, they took our concerns seriously, and they were able to appoint judges in a more timely fashion. But it's a work in progress, so it's not the final result. I think it's a work in progress, and we have to make sure for the next couple of months that the government continue to make those appointments on a timely fashion, and that we'll watch this file very closely.
Mm-hmm. And of course, there's also retirements, and it had me thinking, as you were addressing that in your news conference as well today, you were noting the fact that on average, it seems to be the practice that a judge will give about a 6-month notice period before retirement. Does there need to be some type of regulation, codification, where it's a longer period than just 6 months, so that the court can be ready, that the Attorney General's office could be ready to fill those positions so that they are never left open?
Yeah. So what you're suggesting is very reasonable. I think it's up to the elected officials, to the government, to decide on the scheme according to which these appointments will be made. I don't think it's up to us, the judges, to decide, you should appoint judges within a month, 2 months, 3 months from the date you received a letter of resignation, for instance. But I think it should be made within a reasonable delay. What I'm saying is that government on the federal level knows about the date when a position will become vacant. They know that many months in advance. So they should find a scheme to make sure that the position will be filled once the post is vacated. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a way, because they've done it for the last couple of months. I think they should find a way to do it for the future.
Before we're done, I want to go back to democratic institutions. We began by talking about that. I'm wondering, when you reflect on this annual news conference that you give, how important is it for you to be able to answer those questions and give that statement when we talk about the trust in public institutions?
Well, I think it's very important. I've decided when I became Chief Justice to find ways to initiate steps to make the court more transparent, to give the right information, to make sure that people had access to our decisions. So that's why we had, the case in brief on one page. People can learn about a decision in accessible language. We have the annual review. We sat outside of Ottawa two times in the past. I have my press conference once a year. We have nothing to hide. I want people to know what we're doing, because we have a good system. In spite of our challenges, in spite of lack of funding, sometimes in spite of lack of judges, we have still a good justice system. And people should know about it. And they should know it's difficult for people to appreciate something that you don't know. So my concern is to make sure that people know about the court, know about the judges, know about our work, how we do it, and why we do it.
Chief Justice, always appreciate the time. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Well, time now for a look at what else happened in politics today. The Assembly of First Nations is expressing disappointment, upset with the lack of progress and the calls for justice from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Given to the Prime Minister and to Parliament 5 years ago to the day, the final inquiry report included 231 calls, but since 2019, only 2 have been fulfilled.
Regrettably, the report's findings indicate that only 2 of the calls for justice impacting First Nations have been fully implemented over the past 5 years. With the majority showing minimal to no progress, this failure is not acceptable to our people.
The AFN National Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Neepanak also says she still has hope progress can be made, but is calling on Canadians and all levels of government to work for meaningful change. At the time of this writing, the government's pharmacare legislation, Bill C-64, is expected to pass third reading tonight. It will then go to the Senate for further study. The legislation, introduced in February, will cover free birth control and diabetes medication and equipment if enacted. National Pharmacare, of course, a key piece of the supply and confidence agreement between the governing Liberals and opposition NDP. The vast majority of Canadians, 84%, are at least somewhat concerned about mis- and disinformation right now. That finding courtesy of Abacus data in a poll commissioned by CPAC.
I think we've very quickly found fairly common and broad agreement, despite vast disagreements on a lot of things. The left and the right, east or west, young or old, are almost all united in saying this is a problem.
According to the Abacus CPAC survey, 32% of respondents say they are very concerned about the spread of disinformation, and 52% say they were somewhat concerned. But only 1 in 3 Canadians say they fact-check what they see online. You can read more about the survey on our website, cpac.ca, under Articles. And finally, the Pride flag was raised on Parliament Hill this morning, marking the beginning of Pride Month. The Prime Minister was there touting his government's record on 2S LGBTQIA+ issues and condemning some provinces for restricting gender-affirming care for trans youth.
Last year, we've seen too many people, including some politicians, shown that they're willing to target vulnerable trans youth, to deny them the freedom to seek life-saving gender-affirming care, all for narrow political gain.
Well, this country's largest federal public service union has new leadership. Sharon De Sousa, elected by the Public Service Alliance of Canada members last week. Now, previously, she was the National Executive VP, and she's the union's first racialized president now. Her election coming as well as the union faces a number of key issues. They include 9,000 Canada Border Services Agency workers who may take job action this month, and the federal government's 3-day return to office mandate. Sharon De Sousa joins us right now in studio. Ms. De Sousa, thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure.
Now, I'll say it for both of us, because your voice is a bit gruff because you just came out of a union convention. So thank you for being here. Really appreciate the time. And I do want to begin right now with the CBSA workers, because they are right now in negotiations. June 6th, if I'm correct, is the first day they could go on strike. How are talks going right now?
Well, we just started talks, and we're currently in mediation. And it is our hope that this federal government, Canada Border Services Agency, has come to the table to deal with our two main issues. One is equitable retirement, and as well as discussing a wage that is comparable to other law enforcement agencies.
A wage comparable to law enforcement agencies. But when you talk about an equitable retirement, what are the parameters of that?
Well, it's a little bit more complicated, but right now you have to work longer compared to other agencies, law enforcement agencies, to have your retirement benefits. And that's just not fair. We want our members to retire with dignity and respect. And based on the mental health and stress of the job, we want to ensure that our members are able to enjoy their retirement, considering all the different dangerous factors that they face.
Now, the Treasury Board has already gone in and said that 90% of CBSA workers are considered essential. So I'm wondering, with that type of declaration from essentially management in this situation, does that hobble your negotiations from the workers' side?
Well, what I can tell you is this. Our members are strong, they're mighty, and they're fierce. And they're able to take on any form of challenges that come their way. And so, yes, maybe 90% is essential, but where there's a will, there's a way.
Okay, so we'll be watching that closely. As we say, the date is coming up quickly. Now, another issue I want to talk about, and this is again a holdover from the last president, but it is the issue of a return to work. PSAC right now resisting the 3-day-a-week mandate that the federal government wants to put out there. You know, I'm wondering how you sell that to Canadians. When we saw a recent Angus Reid Institute poll that said 59% of Canadians think, you know, going back to work more frequently in the week is a good thing, how do you make the argument that it is not good for your workers?
Well, what I can tell you is this. It's not a return to work, because our members have been working right throughout the pandemic, and they continue to work. That's not the issue. The issue is the arbitrary decision to unilaterally decide that they're going to have 3 days in the office when we know that the facilities are not quite up to snuff. We know that for a fact. There's bed bugs, there's bats in some locations, and there's not enough workstations at all. So they have to deal with the health and safety issues. And if 2 days isn't working, 3 days won't. But also, this is Canada's largest employer. They have the capacity to set the trend for what work looks like. And we have reports that state working from home is actually beneficial for work-life balance, but also it acts as a safe work environment where people are more productive. The nature of work has changed. It's no longer butts in a seat, but actually it's about the fact that we were able to prove that they were productive during the pandemic. So why wouldn't you choose to be leaders?
Well, I hear what you're saying, but again, the majority of Canadians in polls recently say that they support more in-office time for federal workers. Do you risk alienating the Canadian public by taking up this fight? Whether or not you have an issue as to how the Treasury Board came up with this decision, are you concerned about alienating the Canadian public?
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because unions were the leaders in maternity and paternity leave. We were leaders in various work environments to push the envelope forward and change the nature of work. And here we are again, changing that nature of work. So as far as I'm concerned, what we're asking for is not a cookie cutter approach. What we're asking, where possible, to look at the idea of telework. And I think when we look at it from that perspective, we definitely know that it will benefit all workers.
So when you hear the Treasury Board president say that it is essentially within the purview of the federal government and the Treasury Board to determine where work is located, what do you say to that?
What I would say is they have a legal obligation to consult, and they didn't do that. We actually had the ability to negotiate language, to discuss the issue at length. And we were very clear. We wanted not a cookie cutter approach. We wanted consultation, and we wanted to ensure that where it was denied, that there was a capacity to review decisions to make sure that they're equitable. It's sad to say that once again, we see the federal government acting arbitrarily. We saw it with the Phoenix pay fiasco. We've seen it with Canada Life, and here we are again. And our members are just fed up with this.
Well, again, we'll watch that as it goes along. But, before we are done, it has been noted that you are the first racialized person to become president of the PSAC. Will that have any bearing on what you want to accomplish as union president?
Well, what I can tell you is I have a couple of intersectional identities. I'm a racialized person, yes, but I'm also a woman. And so as far as I'm concerned, that lens leads to the work that is ahead of us. And I want to build an inclusive union where everyone can see themselves reflected in the leadership, but also part of the decision-making capacity within our union. And we want to make sure that all members are free of discrimination and harassment in the workplace. They're safe and healthy and have work-life balance. So that's what my goals are.
Well, you have just begun. I look forward to future conversations with you. But for this evening, Sharon De Sousa, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, we have a new poll out today, this one from Reuters Ipsos, and it shows a majority of Americans do not think Donald Trump should serve any prison time. Last week, the presumptive Republican nominee became the first U.S. president to also become a convicted felon, found guilty in all 34 counts of falsifying business records in connection to hush money paid to an adult film star ahead of the 2016 U.S. vote. Jurors were unanimous in their verdict, but the American public is divided on the punishment for those crimes, with 51% opposing a prison sentence and 46% in favor of one. That same poll also concluding a prison sentence could lose Trump votes in the November election. Well, for more on Donald Trump and where things stand right now legally, we're joined by David Weinstein, currently a partner at Jones Walker in Miami. He's also a former U.S. federal prosecutor for the Southern District of Florida. Mr. Weinstein, thank you for joining us.
Oh, Michael, my pleasure.
So, let's begin with this question of whether or not Donald Trump should serve any prison time. Do you think a prison sentence is likely in the Trump case? Could Donald Trump go to jail?
I think there's a very low probability that he will actually go to jail, and that's dependent upon a variety of factors, including but not limited to the fact that he is a former president and as such is afforded Secret Service protection. That doesn't mean that he couldn't be sentenced to prison and they wouldn't have to figure out an arrangement whereby he would still have a Secret Service protection. But there's a number of other factors that are going to a decision as to whether or not to impose a prison sentence. Look, there are 34 counts of conviction. They are all felonies for which he could serve up to 4 years in prison. But then you also have to look at what the crime was that was committed. Was it a violent or a not violent crime? And this was clearly not a violent crime. Then you also have to look at the age of a defendant. You have to look at the health of a defendant. And then you have to look at whether or not this sentence is meant to be strictly punishment, which it is not, or whether or not it's intended also to have a deterrent effect on the rest of the public at large and people who would consider doing this. And then you have to look at sentences that have been handed down to similarly situated defendants. How many other defendants who have been accused of and convicted of this same type of crime are actually sent to jail? And if so, how many counts of conviction were there? How extensive was the criminal behavior? And if they were sentenced, how long was their sentence in jail? So I think all of those factors together are going to contribute to a sentence which, in all likelihood, does not involve any actual incarceration.
Okay, in all likelihood, as you say, although that would be sentencing, and right now we heard immediately from his legal team, Donald Trump himself, saying that they will be appealing the verdict. On what grounds might an appeal actually be filed here?
Well, there are a number of grounds, Michael, that he can take up on appeal. Some of them starting from as early on as jury selection and their motion to change venue, saying that they don't believe they could receive a fair and impartial trial in the place where the trial was held. That one is, quite frankly, probably their weakest argument. Just because a particular borough of New York doesn't like you or that another borough likes you more, that's not justification for moving the trial. The judge heard their arguments, he evaluated them under the facts and the law and rejected them. But that's something that they will again raise when they take the appeal. I think that what they're going to focus on are going to be the jury instructions that were given, not with regard to how they found him guilty or not guilty, but rather this other crime that they found him guilty of, which was necessary to elevate this from a misdemeanor to a felony. And the judge gave a somewhat variation of a standard instruction and told them that they didn't have to all agree on what the particular crime was. And so that's something the defense will attack. There were some other jury instructions that they objected to. In addition to that, the judge did not allow them to call a witness that they wanted to call, someone who they said was an expert on federal election campaign laws, and they believed that that would help the jury sort out what the facts and the law were here. The judge did not allow them to call that witness, so that's something they will take up on appeal. The judge also set parameters for what questions could be asked of the defendant if he chose to take the stand and testify in his own defense. And the judge was going to allow them to get into certain areas regarding other cases where he had already previously been convicted, either individually or as part of a corporation, that were civil cases but not criminal. And so they're going to argue that that played into the defendant's decision as to whether or not he would take the stand. I think we all remember their motion for mistrial during the testimony that was provided by Stormy Daniels. That's something they will again raise as they take the case up on appeal. The problem with that is that for a long time they didn't object to certain questions. When they finally did, it was perhaps too late. And so that's going to factor into whether or not the Court of Appeals believes that's enough to overturn the conviction.
Okay, so several avenues that we need to be watching out for. You know, quickly losing time here, Mr. Weinstein, but before we're done, I have a couple more questions, so I'm going to ask for some quick answers, if you will. First and foremost, do you think a decision on an appeal will be made before sentencing? Is that how these things usually go?
No, it won't, and that's not how things go. His appeal is going to stretch out way past the November election. Quite frankly, we'll all be lucky if we hear a decision on the first level of appeal by the end of the year.
So if that is the case, then, if he becomes U.S. president, does that have any bearing on this case whatsoever?
Well, it doesn't really, because it's a state conviction. A president cannot pardon himself or anyone on a state conviction. He'd have to ask the governor of the state of New York for clemency or a pardon. That even raises the question of whether or not a president could even pardon himself. That remains to be seen as well.
Okay, so uncharted territory as we continue to follow this case. David Weinstein, really appreciate the time. I look forward to speaking with you again. As you say, this will drag out a bit, so without a doubt, we'll be reaching out in future. But for today and for this evening, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Glad I could help.
And that is Primetime Politics for this Monday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. The program will be back tomorrow evening. Until then, take care.